Good morning, eighth graders. I hope that you guys are having a beautiful week. This week we're going to begin cracking open the Gospels. We've talked about some things that help lead us up to this, and now for the first time we get to actually really start taking a closer look. So I'm excited to begin our study of the Gospel of Matthew. And what I want you to know about the Gospel of Matthew is that Matthew was written by, first of all, Matthew was a tax collector. His Hebrew name was Levi. And a tax collector, in case you're wondering, was not the most um, respected member of society. In fact, quite the opposite. A tax collector was seen as a traitor, like the person who you couldn't trust, the worst of the worst. Let me put it this way. The Hebrew people were being occupied. That means that foreigners, Romans, had come in on their land and was ruling over them by the sword, with an iron fist. And part of that rule was that they would take money from them. Well, you can imagine that this isn't a popular thing. I mean, I would like to be ruled by maybe by voting or by people that know my land or people that know me, and to be ruled by some guy who's never even been here thousands of miles away was not cool. And to make things worse, they were very heavy-handed. Like if you disobeyed, they would just kill you. This was not a happy way of being ruled at all. And tax collectors were the people that worked for the Romans, but were Jews. In other words, they were like people in the community who knew everybody's name and who grew up there, like just like everybody else. And yet, they chose so that they could make more money. They chose to work for what the Jewish people saw as the enemy. So you can see why they saw them as traitors, as people that they didn't trust. And Matthew was one of these men. And yet, one day, Jesus was walking by and saw Matthew, saw Levi standing there, working the office. And he looked at him and he said, "Come and follow me." Think about that for a minute. Everybody in the world, everybody that Matthew knew, despised him. They would spit at him as he walked by. They were disgusted with him. And yet, here comes Jesus, this incredible man, this incredibly great teacher, this leader. And he looks at Matthew and he doesn't see all of the mess. He doesn't see all of the ugliness. He knows it's there. He's not blind. But he sees Matthew for who he really is. And he asks Matthew to leave all of that sinful life behind him, and instead to come and change his entire way of being to be with him. Imagine what that must have been like. I mean, you have your life, your whole life, and some of it's good and some of it's bad. It's just the nature of things. You have your whole life. You have your mom and your dad. You have your job. You have the things you do. You have everything that's just your life. And then suddenly some guy says, "Leave it all and come with me, and we will do great things." And Matthew, to his great credit, does it. He says yes, and he drops his money bags right there, and he leaves the stand right there, walks directly away, walks with Jesus' disciples, and away he goes. I wonder how his disciples must have felt. I bet they didn't trust him. I mean, if I were one of the disciples and I'm basically a decent guy, and here Jesus calls this guy who I know is not a decent guy, he's a tax collector. I think it probably took the disciples a little while to learn to trust Matthew, to see if Matthew really meant what he was doing, really was trying to be as good as Matthew looked like he was trying to be. But in the end, he was, and he ended up giving his life for Jesus. And this gospel was written by him. But the thing I want you to notice is that this gospel because it's written by Matthew, is written by somebody who's a part of the Jewish community. Like, he knows everything they do. He grew up as a Jew. He lived his whole life as a Jew. And so he knows the Jewish things. And so he wrote his gospel, the book that we're about to start studying. He wrote it primarily talking to the Jewish people. And so as we read it, some of the things are going to sound just a little bit weird to you and me, because we didn't grow up 2,000 years ago in ancient Israel, right? Even if you grew up in Israel today, some of this stuff would still sound a little bit weird, because he's talking to a very specific group of people. So let's look at the very beginning of this book. I have the Bible with me today, so you might see me looking down at it. The very first thing Matthew does is he starts with something called a genealogy. What's a genealogy? Well, a genealogy is when you list out all of your family tree, right? Like, who was my dad, and who was my mom, and who was my dad's dad, and who was my dad's mom, and who was my mom's dad, and who was my mom's mom, and then who was my dad's dad's dad, and who was my dad's dad's mom. Like, you figure out the whole family tree, right? Well, that's exactly what Matthew does. Is he spends the first actual few paragraphs going through talking about the lineage of Jesus, where Jesus comes from. Now, if it was you and me, we probably wouldn't do this. But for Jews, this was really important. Not just a little important, super important. Because this genealogy is going to tell you who Jesus is. And it starts with Abraham. You might remember Abraham from last year. We're talking about the patriarch. Remember, the patriarch Abraham was given the great promise, right? The promise that his line would become a nation, that all the world would be saved through his children. And as we go through and he lists them one by one, every single father's name. This person begat this person, and this person begat this person, and this person had this person, right? And as he goes through this list, we see all sorts of figures from the Bible come alive. Like, all of this stuff that happened in the Old Testament is leading directly to Jesus. Every single one of these people are related, and they come down like one great family until he comes to David. And now he's saying that Jesus is a son of David. And he goes through the whole family all the way down to Joseph. And Joseph of course, is Mary's husband, so he's officially the father. Mary comes from the same line, by the way. But he's saying this Jesus is the thing that we, as Hebrews, have been waiting and praying for thousands of years. That the thing that we've been expecting, the thing we've been waiting for, has come. It ends this way. Achim, the father of Eliud. Eliud, the father of Eleazar. Eleazar became the father of Mathan. Mathan became the father of Jacob. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Of her was born Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And then he begins, now that we know who this Jesus is, we framed him in history. We've said this person fits within all of the stuff that happened in the Old Testament and is now being brought forth in the New Testament, that we're seeing that it's all connected. It's all one great story, that you can't take them apart, because Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these things that we've been praying for and hoping for thousands of years. Then, and only then, after he tells you the lineage, he tells us about the birth of Jesus. And he sits there making sure that we know who he is. Now, Matthew tells this story from Joseph's point of view. And this is important, because I want you to see that he's being connected to the old stories, right? Well, Joseph, his dad, here's what happens. I'll give you the short story. The angel comes to Mary, and she is with child through the Holy Spirit. It doesn't really talk too terribly much about how that happened. Luke will talk about that. But Matthew recognizes that Joseph is put in a very hard position. Joseph, Mary's husband, because Joseph is Mary's husband, but they haven't actually gotten married yet. They're just engaged, like fiance, but more intense than a fiance. And suddenly Mary's pregnant. And this, as you might imagine, is scandalous. I mean, what is Joseph supposed to think? How did his fiance get pregnant? He knows it wasn't him. And so what is he going to do? Well, there's a lot of things he could do. Number one, he could tell everybody in the world and she would be stoned to death. Well, that's bad. We don't want that to happen. So Joseph he could marry her anyway and pretend like it's his, but that would be lying. He doesn't want to do that. He could marry her, but never, but marry her in a way. There's a special kind of marriage that was common between a very religious that would not have any close relationship. Like they would be married, so like he'd take care of her, but they wouldn't like live in the same room or anything. That's an option. Or he could just try and quietly divorce her and leave it all quiet, and hopefully nothing will happen. He decides to do the last thing. He doesn't feel like he can marry someone he can't trust. That makes sense, right? And he doesn't want her to, but he doesn't want her to die. He doesn't want her to get stoned to death, so he doesn't want to make a big deal out about this. So he's going to divorce her quietly. But then something happens. An angel comes to him in a dream. Do you remember another Joseph that had dreams? Way, way back in the Old Testament, we had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons. And one of those sons was named Joseph. Joseph, who was the king of dreams, who would get dreams and would be able to interpret them, who became the head guy to the Pharaoh, Joseph. And we see that this Joseph has the same kind of connection with God. That the angel comes to him in a dream, just like the old Joseph. And there, the angel tells him, let's see if I can find the words. The angel appeared to him and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife into your home, for it is through the Holy Spirit that this child has been conceived in her. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Imagine if you're Joseph. You're asleep, and suddenly you have the most intense dream you've ever had in your life. I mean, like it just shakes you, like you wake up sweating, and you could still feel like the electricity in the air from the angel's presence, right? Like in his dream, he sees this angel, and this angel tells him what's really going on. And then the angel is gone. And there's Joseph sitting in the dark, in the cold, just having had this experience, having to make sense of it all. And Joseph, like the Joseph of old, recognizes the truth of this dream, recognizes what's really happening in this dream, and realizes that this woman that he was going to marry is not unfaithful to him, but instead is one of the most faithful young women that have ever walked the face of the earth. The one who will bear the Messiah. And thus it is said, and so Matthew then quotes the Old Testament again. Behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and thou shalt name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. So when Joseph awoke, he did exactly what the angel commanded him to do. just like the Joseph of old, right? And he had no relations with her, but he married her nonetheless. They had that second kind of marriage. Now, this is where things get interesting. Because as Joseph is now married to this woman, now he's Jesus' dad. He's going to be the dad of this child, or stepfather, I think maybe is the way we would say it now. But so he has some serious responsibilities, but there's a problem. You see, he's just a poor carpenter in Nazareth. Nazareth is a nowhere town. Like, you know how sometimes when you maybe travel down to San Francisco or Santa Rosa, you drive through all those little towns, like Laytonville? Laytonville's in the middle of nowhere. Not very many people live there. It's just somewhere you stop when you're going through, right? That's Nazareth. Joseph is from not a very important place. And he's got to take care of this woman. He's got to figure out how to pay for it. He's got to take care of it. But notice that Matthew is going to tell us this story in a focus in a different way. You see, at this point, Joseph has entered into God's world. At this point, from now on, Joseph is going to have to follow God's way of doing things. And that's going to be hard for Joseph. It's going to be crazy for Joseph, just like it was for the Joseph of old. Joseph of old didn't want to become a slave, didn't want to go work for Potiphar. He didn't want to live in prison, and yet this was the path that God took him so that he could save all of the people, right? And he did. And Joseph walked that path. And this new Joseph is going to do the same thing. And the very first thing that happens is the emperor of Rome calls a census. And the way Matthew puts this, it's almost as if the whole world is bending to God's will to make sure that Jesus does everything that God said Jesus would do. In the Old Testament, it said that the Messiah would be a Nazarene. They call him a Nazarene. In other words, from Nazareth. They also said he'd be born in Bethlehem. And sure enough, this census requires everybody to go back to their family hometown. And since Joseph is of the family of David, that means he has to go to a town called Bethlehem. And there he goes, dragging his poor, very, very pregnant wife along with him because he has to. Do you think that not a fun trip? Torture the whole way. He didn't want to leave his house, but he's got to do whatever he's told to do. And so now he goes, and this is where Jesus will be born. Shortly after Jesus is born, more stuff happens that was promised. It was said that the Messiah would be a light to the Gentiles. And the very first thing that happens is 3 kings from 3 different continents around the world come to see him. The Gentiles come and sit at his feet. And then because the king of that land, Herod, is frightened that this king that's being born, he sends a bunch of people to kill all the children. Well, Joseph gets away, but now Herod wants him dead. And so they have to flee the land entirely and live as refugees. And where does he go? He goes to Egypt. Why is that important? Because in the Old Testament it said, out of Egypt I will call my son. So here's what I want you to notice about Matthew. Matthew, as we read the gospel, is very focused on the Old Testament. He's mirroring everything that's happening there. He's showing how Jesus is fulfilling everything that's happening in the Old Testament. That we're seeing the same kind of relationship between Joseph. We're seeing all these scriptures being fulfilled. We're seeing that Jesus is of the right lineage. Matthew is very concerned about making sure that the Jewish people really understand that Jesus is the Messiah that they've been waiting for, right? And this is going to help us as we really try to delve into Matthew. Everything is going to come from that standpoint, from that viewpoint. We're going to see that he's time and time again coming back to trying to understand how is Jesus the Messiah of the Old Testament that you and I have been waiting for our whole lives. And that's the basic idea behind Matthew. Next week, we're going to go ahead and start looking at what it is that Jesus actually says once he enters the scene. What kind of teachings does this new Messiah give? And we'll find out more about that next week. May God bless you this week, and I look forward to seeing you in class. God bless.